So it's a particular honour to be able to talk to the RUSI again. Mike Carlton, of course, was here recently talking on the Flagship HMAS Australia, and at that time I was actually in the Coral Sea on a cruise ship talking about the Battle of the Coral Sea. But it's important that we establish a link between the two presentations. And the first one is I'm not a naval architect. And the second one is I don't know Peter Fitzsimons. My father did not enlist in the second AIF when the war in Europe started. He had a view that it was not of great concern to Australia. But he told me as soon as the Japanese entered the war, so did he. So he was a fitter and turner by trade. I was a great disappointment to him. I don't know one end of a Phillips head screwdriver from whatever the other one's called. And he went to Flinders Naval Depot in Victoria and Chief Petty Officer Ordnance Artillery. And he was very proud of his service on Hobart. And unusually, he stayed on the ship. As our naval colleagues will tell you, they're posted from ship to base around different units. He wasn't. Once Hobart had been torpedoed and had returned to Garden Island, the engineers, artificers included, of course, he actually stayed posted on the ship. And so while he had friends who were posted on and off 2 or 3 times, he stayed on board. He served right through the Pacific War and was in Tokyo Bay for the surrender. It's a most significant naval battle in military history because it's the first sea battle between aircraft carriers. It was fought in the air, and so it was actually the first naval battle where the ships not only didn't see each other, but did not fire directly on each other. And where are we? We're in the Coral Sea, and that's here. You've got the north of Australia here, Port Douglas and Cairns, Port Moresby, Kokoda, Milne Bay here, and the various passages, the Jomard Passage here, which was the intended route of the invasion fleet for Port Moresby. I intend talking about the Japanese war plan, what the advances were that the Japanese made in the Southwest Pacific area, Operation Mo, what the opposing forces were in the battle itself, the result of that battle and the aftermath. The Japanese war plan was very straightforward. The aim was to destroy the United States Navy's carrier fleet at Pearl Harbor. They failed simply because the carrier fleet were not there. They were at sea. And you're all well aware of the destruction that was inflicted on the US Navy's battleships at Pearl Harbor. The aim then was to invade Southeast Asia, Java. The principal reason for that, of course, was to secure oil fields, natural resources. The Americans, the United States, had in fact put in place an embargo on such imports to Japan as a result of their invasion of China, where they occupied Manchuria and set up Manchukuo, their province there. The whole idea then was that their planning at that stage was then to turn west towards Burma and India. And of course, the expansion was incredibly fast. It was a driving charge down from mainland here, and this is the area of China that they occupied. And of course they came down south and of course subsequently southeast of Australia when they changed their plan. But all this was done within the 6 months of the attack on Pearl Harbor. The plan to come south and then west into Burma and India was changed. And there were 2 factors that did this. And one was that they were emboldened by their rapid success. We now call it mission creep. And that's exactly what it was. And they kept going and going and going because of the successes that they were having against the Allied forces. And there was also Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle's surprise raid on bombing raid on Japan. And that was one hell of a surprise to the Japanese. And so you had in April of 42, Doolittle of the US Army Air Force launched 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers off the carrier USS Hornet without fighter escort. They got as close to Japan as they could before they were sighted, and they launched. 15 aircraft. They didn't return to the carrier. They crashed in mainland China. One actually landed in Vladivostok in Russia, and the crew was promptly interned by the Russians, so-called allies. As you can see there, the casualties, some 9 were killed, but most eventually returned home. Doolittle, of course, was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor and promoted to Brigadier General as a result. It didn't cause any damage to Japan at the time. It was nothing like the firebombing raids which were subsequent in 1944, particularly 1945. But what it did, of course, was it lifted the local morale. The Americans had suffered the attack on Pearl Harbor, a stunning blow, and they were now able to, in fact, strike a blow back. And it was a slap in the face compared to the fist in the face that they got at Pearl Harbor. But it caused great consternation in Japan, particularly amongst the military leaders, because they could no longer guarantee the protection of the emperor. And it also caused them, quite obviously, to retain aircraft back in the mainland of Japan and could not be deployed into their advances south and southeast. And so that's what changed the Japanese plan. And they changed their plans so that invading, instead of going west Burma to India, they decided first to expand eastward and through to Midway and then, of course, south to Australia. And the whole idea was to provide a buffer around Japan, as well as being able to get access to the natural resources that they needed, so that the bombing of the mainland could not occur again. The advances, as you can see here, the driving charge, Thailand, they already occupied French Indochina because the French, having surrendered to the Germans in 1940, the Vichy French government was pro-Nazi, so the Japanese forces were able to occupy what we now know as Vietnam without any opposition at all. Cam Ranh Bay was in fact a major Japanese naval base. The rest you are all familiar with. The charge down Malaya, the loss of Singapore, capturing Borneo, the Philippines, of course, driving MacArthur out of the Philippines, one of the great actors in the war. General Eisenhower was once asked, have you ever served with General MacArthur? He said, yes, I studied acting under him in the Philippines. And of course, then down to New Guinea, Rabaul, and as a result, of course, of the Battle of the Coral Sea, having to land at Buna. And of course, they occupied Timor, which is getting very close to the Australian mainland. For the Navy, of course, significant naval battles, of course. The Battle of the Java Sea, which saw the heroic loss of HMAS Yarra, and as our naval officers here will tell you, no member of the Royal Australian Navy has ever been awarded the Victoria Cross. And the reason for that, of course, is, particularly in World War II, the Royal Australian Navy fought under command of the British Admiralty, and no recommendations were made. Of course, you then had the Battle of the Strait here, which saw the loss of HMAS Perth, which Mike Carlton, of course, spoke about, along with the USS Houston, which is why Perth and Houston are sister cities. You have, of course, the Battle of the Coral Sea. You then have the major battle in the Pacific of Midway. And then, of course, you have the Battle of Savo Island, just north of Guadalcanal, which saw the loss of HMAS Canberra, torpedoed by the Americans. Fact. Of course, then there were the Japanese attacks on Australia, the bombing of Darwin. Most people think that Darwin was bombed once. It wasn't. There were repetitive raids on Darwin for some 18 months. Very few people are aware of that. Broome was attacked, and the tragedy there, of course, was that the airliners, the Empire-class flying boats and so on, were actually in Roebuck Bay when the Japanese attacked. And they were full of Dutch families who of course were evacuating from Timor. A horrific and tragic story there. They bombed Catherine, the Adelaide River, and they also bombed Townsville. Very few people in Townsville know that, unless of course you go to the museum in Townsville. The bombing of Catherine represented the deepest incursion into the Australian mainland by the Japanese in World War II. Of course, there was the submarine attack on the 31st of May. The day before the submarine attack, of course, the Japanese launched a seaplane from their submarine, which flew over Sydney unmolested, took all the photos it needed, and decided that the target would be the USS Chicago. What's that up there? Is it a bird? Is it not? We want to go there. And so, there was, of course, many attacks by Japanese submarines along the east coast of Australia. My father was home in Randwick on the night of the attack, the shelling of Sydney. What happened subsequent to the submarine incursion, the mother submarine surfaced off Maroubra and fired a salvo of rounds from its deck gun, which landed in Double Bay and Rose Bay. You could buy a property there the next morning for £5. The people in Double Bay immediately evacuated west to Lura, which is why Lura is known as Double Bay Mountains. This went on for a considerable period of time. As you can see, a considerable number of ships were sunk and damaged, of course. Operation Mo was the Japanese operation to take control of Papua New Guinea. The whole aim was to isolate Australia and New Zealand from the United States. There was not a plan by the Japanese at that point in time to invade Australia. There was a dispute between the Imperial Japanese Navy and the Imperial Japanese Army. The Navy wanted to invade Australia and the Army didn't. And the reason the Imperial Japanese Army didn't want to invade Australia was it would mean they had to draw troops from China. And the Army was particularly concerned about the threat of Russia entering the war against Japan. Now they didn't, of course, until August 1945, which I think, a personal view, is that it ranks equally with the dropping of the atomic bombs as to the reason why Japan surrendered when they did at the end of World War II. Don't tell the Americans that. The whole idea, of course, was simply to take Australia out of the war, particularly as a base for the Allies for future operations against the Japanese occupation. And of course, perhaps eventually they would have invaded Australia and perhaps at least taken control of the north of Australia at least. Let's not raise the question of the Brisbane line at this time. So they planned a three-pronged attack. The first was to occupy an island which is immediately north of the Solomon Islands there, destroy Allied sea power in the area and invade Port Moresby with an amphibious operation. And so with regards to Tulagi Island, the whole idea there was to set up a seaplane base and they would be able from there to fly south and east on reconnaissance patrols, locate the Allied ships and engage them and destroy them. And of course, to look then at protecting from here the flank of the seaborne carrier force which was to land at Port Moresby, travelling of course through the Coral Sea. Prior to this, as you can see, the US Navy Signals Intelligence Unit, which had been in Corregidor, was transferred to Melbourne. They didn't move into the hotel room that MacArthur had taken, but they were there, joined up with the RAM unit, of course, and they detected this signal. That the objective of Mo will be to first restrict the enemy fleet movements and will be accomplished by means of attacks on the north coast of Australia. Not invasion. The opposing forces, well, as it happened, the Coral Sea battle was straddled two different operational commands. The South Pacific area, which was commanded by the US Navy officer Admiral Gormley, and of course you had MacArthur here in the Southwest Pacific area, and then next to that you had the other great actor in the war, Mountbatten, in Southeast Asia Command. The opposing forces, if you look, certainly the Japanese had a lot more smaller ships, but if you look at the major shipping there, it's roughly equal. Both had fleet carriers. The Japanese had an additional light carrier, same number of destroyers and cruisers, and so it was a reasonably evenly balanced force, apart from the smaller ships that the Japanese had. Of course, the aircraft, the fighters, we all know about this era. It ranks with the Spitfire as famous fighters of World War II. And you can see there the speed, roughly equivalent, machine guns firing for the Zero through the engine cowling and also the wings. The Zero could carry a light load of bombs, and later in the war, of course, were fitted with 250 kilogram bombs, fixed bombs, for the kamikaze attacks against the American fleet much later in the war. The American fighter was the Wildcat, a similar speed, similar armament, but nowhere near as manoeuvrable as the Zero. Again, he could also carry a very small bomb load. The torpedo bombers for the Japanese, the Cape bomber, you can see the details there. Again, the Cape a little faster, the bomb load's reasonable, a combination there of something like 800 kilograms of bombs in various configurations. The torpedo bomber, the Devastator, carried less bombs, but they were principally torpedo bombers. And you can see there that for the Japanese it was an 800 kilogram torpedo and a much larger torpedo carried by the Devastator. The dive bombers, the Val and the Dauntless, see the comparison there, crew of 2 for the Japanese, crew of 3 in the Douglas. Speeds, again, comparable. Machine gun armament, again, very similar. Both of them had rear-firing machine guns so that the observer could, in fact, engage attacking aircraft from the rear. And, of course, you can see the bomb load there. A little less for the Val, something like 250 kilogram maximum, or a mix of bombs. The Dauntless could carry something just around 1,000 kilograms of bombs in various configurations. The commander of the Japanese force was Vice Admiral Inoue, who in fact had been critical of the Navy's shipbuilding program. He was a carrier man, and so he was concerned about the emphasis on battleships rather than carriers, and that of course was an internal battle that was fought in the US Navy as well. He was given command of the 4th Fleet, which is based in Truk, which the Japanese had captured. And he moved to Rabaul at the very top of New Britain for the operation. He was, however, relieved of his command after his defeat in the Coral Sea. The Allied commander, the Vice Admiral Fletcher, a distinguished sailor, won a Medal of Honour in rescuing refugees off a transport ship, and he was appointed commander of Task Force 17. Which took part in the Battle of the Coral Sea, the landings at Guadalcanal, and the Battle of the East Solomons. This is the plan. And the colours, the green shows the invasion group, which is sailing directly south from Rabaul through the Jomar Passage here, and that was its intended route. It was stopped here. You then had a carrier striking force, which is here, coming around the Solomon Islands. You had the Tulagi invasion force coming again from Rabaul to Tulagi. Rabaul was central to Japanese dominance in the area, and in fact the subsequent Allied invasion of New Britain cut off Rabaul. They never actually landed or engaged the Japanese forces in Rabaul. And after the surrender, when the Allies turned up in Rabaul, they were very surprised to find there were 79,000 Japanese troops there. And of course you've got the covering force as well coming down here, obviously to protect the flank of the fleet. And from there, of course, they were to engage targets in the very north of Australia. Nimitz had two carrier groups, Task Force 11 based on the Lexington and Task Force 17 based on the Yorktown. And within Task Force 17 we had an attack group, as you can see there, 5 cruisers, 5 destroyers, a support group. The support group was commanded by Rear Admiral Grace of the Royal Navy. Grace was in fact an Australian serving in the Royal Navy. And the support group, as you can see, 3 cruisers, 2 destroyers. And HMAS Australia, HMAS Hobart, USS Chicago were the cruisers in the Task Force 17 support group. So these ships are in this group commanded by Grace. HMAS Australia, which of course Mike Carlton spoke about recently, the Flagship, 8 8-inch guns, 4 twin turrets you can see there. It had, of course, the usual array of anti-aircraft armaments. It had torpedo tube sets, and it also had a seaplane, which you can see there, a big ship. It was damaged by a bomber crash in October of '44. Some people claim that that was the first kamikaze attack. It wasn't. It was just a Japanese bomber that had been so damaged that the pilot just decided to crash onto the Australia. The kamikaze attacks didn't occur until June '45, but HMAS Australia took 5 kamikazes during that campaign, and in fact it was withdrawn from the battle. And in fact, at that point in time, the Royal Australian Navy had only 1 capital ship afloat, HMAS Hobart. My father was very proud of that. Hobart, of course, was a modified Leander-class cruiser, was sister ship of HMAS Sydney and Perth, both of course who were sunk, along with HMAS Ajax and the New Zealand ship Achilles. Ajax and Achilles, along with HMS Exeter, took part in the famous Battle of the River Plate, which saw the scuttling of the Graf's Bay off Montevideo Harbour. It had 8 6-inch guns in 4 turrets. My father's battle station was on X turret here. For a while he was an observer standing outside the turret with earplugs, observing the fall of shot. He got himself a new position after the first engagement. Anti-aircraft guns, 8 quadruple torpedo tube sets, Submarine Walrus seaplane as well. Hobart fought with the Americans right through the Pacific War. Interesting stories, he said that the Yanks fought the war 7 days a week. Hobart, the Royal Australian Navy ship, and Royal ships in the British tradition had divisions, of course, which is essentially a stand-down day. Pirate rig, put out the washing, have the Sunday afternoon off. Not the Yanks. He said they fought the war 7 days a week. They fly a drone, they drag a target over the fleet. So they fly over Hobart, they can't control orders are coming over the bridge. White smoke would appear. He said, and then fly over the Americans, who would throw and fire everything. The sky would turn black because they had gunpowder. He said, more often than not, they hit the plane that was flying the drone. And on one occasion, an American plane ditched next to Hobart, or close to Hobart, so Hobart sails over, picks up the pilot, puts him in the wardroom, and because he had a seaplane headed over, it picked up the plane. And so the Anticipus built this cradle for the plane, put the plane there, sailed back to Submarine Bay, flash, flash, flash. And so the Yanks come along and they said, oh, thanks man, thanks for the pilot. And they're saying, but we've got your plane for you too. Heck man, we don't want the plane. And so they got picked up the plane and dropped it over the side. There were tears in the eyes of the Anticipus. It was, of course, in Sydney the night of the Japanese submarine shelled Sydney. As I said, my father was ashore, he was asleep, and his stepmother came in and, Ray, they're shelling Sydney, they're shelling Something's in here. And he sort of opened his eye and he said, are they landing near here? And she said, no. He said, wake me when they do. The difference between someone who's been under fire and someone who hasn't. Hobart was torpedoed on the Submarine sector. He told me that every night an Australian destroyer escorted them, but on the one night an American destroyer escorted them. They took a fish in the stern. About 12 killed. One sailor was blown from the stern of the ship right out of the ship and ended up on the bow. He told me the ship's bookie was blown overboard. His locker was rattled before he hit the water. This is the Chicago, a big ship, 9 8-inch guns in triple turrets, you can see. 80 aircraft guns, of course. Torpedo tube sets, 4, as you can see here, of the seaplanes in the centre there. And it was, in fact, the target of the midget submarine attack in Sydney Harbour. And of course, as soon as the Chicago became aware of the attack, it immediately slipped its mooring and steamed straight out of the harbour. And of course, it opened fire with some of its minor armaments. And there are still home units in North Sydney that have the results of the Americans firing anything and everything that they could. The battle itself. The initial movements were that 2 carriers sailed from Japan down here, and they were joined by the lighter carrier, the Shoho, which sailed from Truk. And so they married up. The Allied movements, the Lexington had sailed from Pearl Harbor. It married up with the Yorktown in this area here. And of course they were joined by the support group which had sailed from Sydney Harbour. And they of course included Australia, Hobart and Chicago. The Japanese sent a force across to land at that island of Tulagi here. So they invaded that, and you may recall the aim there being to set up a seaplane base. Yorktown and Lexington by this time had entered into the Coral Sea to the south. Yorktown then moved closer to Guadalcanal and carried out a series of raids on the landing force. Sunk a destroyer, sunk a transport ship, and in fact the remaining transport ships retreated and left the land force on the island. The battle developed further. The strike force has now closed in on the northeast there of Guadalcanal. The support group has arrived and married up with the American carriers. And so you have the deployment now of the force, the Allied force joined together. You have the main Japanese carriers here, and you have the light carrier, Japanese carrier there. At this point, the oiler, Neosho, and the USS Sims, the destroyer to escort it, moved away from the fleet as shown there. And of course at this point, both fleets started to search for each other with reconnaissance flights principally. And the Moresby invasion fleet has now arrived on the scene, and the aim of the fleet was to come through these passages here and move to Port Moresby. And that's why, in fact, the support group was positioned there. US pilot spotted the Shoho, and attacks were launched from both Yorktown and Lexington. It's got to be the ugliest aircraft carrier in naval history. In fact, it was originally a capital ship, and they simply built a flight deck on the top of it. And one of the famous messages from the war, the US pilot, scratch one flat top, because they destroyed that with consummate ease. Simultaneously, the Japanese reconnaissance had spotted the fleet oiler and the escorting destroyer here, and he mistakenly alerted the Japanese commander that he'd spotted the main Allied task force. And so, of course, the Japanese launched a massive raid on those two ships, and they sunk the Sims, the destroyer, severely damaged the fleet oiler. Grace manoeuvred his support group to cut off the Japanese invasion force, which is coming due south from Naval through the J-Mark Passage. He positioned his ships there. He had no air cover, so he formed a diamond formation so that they could concentrate their fire against the attacking aircraft. Some 11 Japanese bombers attacked, 5 were destroyed. The second high-level bombing attack again failed to sink any of the Allied ships. And so did the American B-17 bombers, who happened to be flying by and bombed the support group. They'll fire at anything. And so then both fleets had spotted each other, launched simultaneous attacks. The Americans severely damaged one of the main Japanese carriers. The Japanese sank the Lexington, severely damaged the Yorktown. You can see here the Yorktown. Damaged crews had initially established, had successfully saved the ship, but you can see smoke. This is coming up from this is the flight deck, and so the hangars below were on fire. You can see the smoke coming up, and then there was sparks from an electric motor ignited the aviation fuel. You can see here one of the American planes being blown off the deck, and that's how you can see now Lexington dead in the water, and in fact the captain ordered Lexington to be abandoned, and it subsequently sank. Yorktown was also very badly damaged, but again damaged crews were able to prevent the ship from sinking. It was subsequently repaired, and in fact was able to take part in the Battle of Midway a few months later. But as luck ran out at Midway, it was sunk. And so the result was that the Moresby invasion fleet and the remnants of the Japanese task force returned to Rabaul. The Australian ships here remained here until a little later, guarding that passage in case they returned. The losses were roughly even. A little more detail here. You can see the Japanese lost the Allies lost 1 carrier out of 2. Japanese 1 out of 3. No cruisers were sunk. Some were damaged. Destroyer was lost on each fleet. But what's significant here is the losses in aircraft. And while you can see the numbers, 69 for Allied, 92 for the Japanese, but a much higher percentage of the total force. And that denuded Yamamoto of aircraft to take part in the subsequent Battle of Midway. And so for the first time we have the Japanese stopped at sea. And so we now have the measure of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and this whole idea of invincibility had been destroyed. And most importantly, the Moresby invasion force had withdrawn back to Rabaul. Neither of the 2 fleet carriers took part in the Battle of Midway, whereas the Yorktown did. So again, Yamamoto was denuded vital assets in that subsequent battle. And so the invasion of Moresby was stopped, but so was the Japanese Empire's advance through the Pacific. And Curtin, in an address reporting on the Battle of the Sea, took the opportunity to invigorate and alert the nation to the fact that the war was now on our doorstep. Because until now, essentially the war was in Europe, the Middle East, and it wasn't directly affecting Australia. So we still had the VFL, the races every Saturday, very few impositions on the Australian community. And so as you can see there, he's urging them to make a sober and realistic estimate of their duty to the nation. Men are fighting for Australia today, but those who are not fighting have no excuse for not working. And it was Curtin, of course, who changed the focus towards the alliance with America rather than with Great Britain. Because all Churchill could do was defend the United Kingdom, and no British forces were going to be sent east of Suez, particularly after the abortive attempt by the Prince of Wales and Repulse to reinforce Singapore. So the aftermath, a major influence on the subsequent Battle of Midway, because Yamamoto thought that the two USN carriers had been sunk. But as I said, Yorktown in fact took part in the battle and joined Enterprise and Hornet in the Battle of Midway. And that, with the land-based aircraft, US aircraft in Midway, that Yamamoto didn't have the numerical superiority, particularly when combined with the losses of planes in Coral Sea, that he had inspected in the Battle of Midway. And of course the Japanese were forced then to change their strategy in regards to Port Moresby. They were forced to launch a land offensive, landing in Bumagona, forced their way over the Owen Stanley Range, which, as most of us are well aware in Australian history, is one of the epic battles, with the Japanese initially, of course, forcing the militia back to Imata Ridge, 40 kilometres from Port Moresby. Of course, subsequently reinforced by AIF units which were returning, and the Japanese at the end of a long supply line, but also with the change in strategy in as much as Guadalcanal was assessed by the Japanese to be far more important than Port Moresby. So all the resources that would have gone to the Japanese on the Kokoda Trail, in fact, went to Guadalcanal. Of course, the AIF had finally been released by Churchill after Curtin demanded. There's interesting interchanges of telegrams and messages between the Australian government and the UK government about that. But finally they were released and shipped home. But while they were being shipped home, Churchill sent a signal to the convoy diverting it to Burma. Bastard. Ladies and gentlemen, that was the Battle of the Coral Sea.